Hey teachers and parents, before we dive into this project, I thought we would do a little bit of teacher talk to kind of walk you through the process and give you some alternative ideas so that you can best make this lesson work for you and your setup and your students. So to begin, let's talk about the size. You need to decide before your students create if you'd like the final result of their project to be what this one is, 9 by 12, or would you rather have your students work larger and use construction paper that is 12 by 18? There's pros and cons to both. So with a 9 by 12, I did like the smaller scale. Again, that's what I'm working with here. But I found that it was kind of tricky to get these big flowers to fit. They did go off the page a little bit. Now, if your students are going to work 12 by 18, as I'm doing here, you can see I have a lot more room and a lot more space. But speaking of space, this kind of artwork does take up a lot more room, and I know we are all limited on that. So these are just some things to be thinking through as you're deciding how to make this lesson work best for you, your students, and your situation. Now let's talk about the supplies that I used. To create the background lines that you see on that blue paper, the lines you see on the vase, and on the brown construction paper, I was drawing lines and using this as a review of lines with tempera paint inside of a bingo dauber. That does take time to fill all of those empty bingo daubers with paint. And understanding that, I'm giving you some alternatives here. So here's just a look at what it is like to use these paint-filled daubers, and here's how I filled them. I used tempera paint. I filled them about, I would say, 2/3 full. Add a splash of water just to give the paint a little bit more viscosity so it flows through the bottle easily, and then put the top on it and gave it a good shake before sharing it with students. These empty daubers can be found on Amazon, and I will make sure to add a link down below. Like I said, it can be time consuming to fill these, but they do last quite a bit when students are using them. Just a reminder, some little tips. Make sure your students don't shake the bottle because that can cause it to leak. They don't need to slam it down hard. If they're having a hard time getting the paint to flow out of the tip of the bottle, have them give it a gentle squeeze. In fact, while I'm using it here, you can see that I was gently squeezing the bottle. So for this project, your students will need to create 3 patterned papers, one for the background, another for the table, and a third for the vase. You could have them do this in stations. They could rotate from table to table doing different kinds of lines. You could have them change colors, or I was focused on just repetition of line. This project would be great for first and up, especially those who are learning their lines. The repetition would be good. Now, if you don't want to use paint-filled bingo daubers, here are some alternatives for you. You could use tempera sticks and have your students do the exact same concept, a repetition of lines if you wanted them to, using the same color just so they can focus on lines, or you're the art teacher. You can decide if you want them to change it up, totally up to you. These paint sticks are great. You can see it makes a different kind of line, a little bit more textured. Again, they would need to create 3 pieces of paper. Now, if your students are going to work on 12 by 18, they would need to make 1 12 by 18 pattern paper and then 2 9 by 12 pattern papers. If they're working 9 by 12, they would make 3 pattern papers. Hopefully that will become more clear as the lesson goes on. Now, if you don't want to have your students use tempera sticks, maybe it's not something you have, then another alternative would be for your students to simply paint those lines with a paintbrush and tempera paint. I like to keep my tempera paint in a ice cube tray that has a lid so that the paint stays nice and wet. I also have my students clean their brush in a cup of water, and then I have a sponge that we call Dirty Old SpongeBob on hand, and that's what they draw an X on, and that helps them to rinse all of the water out of the brush. For more tips on using tempera paint with students, be sure and check out my video all about that, and I'll make sure to link it down below. The reason I'm throwing all of these alternative ideas at you is because I want you to be able to have success with this lesson without having stress. So if you find that the paint-filled bingo daubers sounds like fun but a lot of work, well, now you've got 2 alternative ideas. If you've already got paint trays ready to roll, then here you go. or you can have your students even use something like markers or crayons if you don't have those paint sticks. So when I share this project with your students, which I'm about to do here momentarily, I'm going to be explaining it to them using my bingo daubers, but you can of course always interject and just say, but hey kids, we're actually going to be using X supply instead. You do you, boo-boo. You just use what works for you and your students. Now let's talk about creating the flowers. So for that, I'm using a non-porous surface. Any non-porous surface, by the way, would work. I happen to be using a pizza pan. I got these, one per student, at the dollar store. But again, any non-porous plastic kind of surface would work for this kind of activity. So for this, for your students to create their flowers, you could have them use those paint-filled daubers. Again, I'm using round paper to pull a print because that's what I had on hand. You could use regular schmegular white paper. It just happened to have the round paper on hand. If you don't want to use the paint-filled daubers, then you could have your students paint directly on the pan and pull a print that way. You could even have your students use markers. That's right, they could draw their flowers with markers. And even if the marker looks like it has dried, hold a spray bottle kind of at a distance to give it a light mist and then pull a print that way. And your students can make a couple of flowers for their still life. Now that we have those details out of the way, let's dive into the project. I'm going to be walking your students how to create the line portion of their project. We're going to be doing that with paint-filled daubers. If you're using a different art supply, just let them know as they're creating. All right, friends, let's do a little bit of line review to start our project. So using my paint marker, I'm going to draw a pattern of lines. So to create a pattern is something that repeats. I have made a zigzag line from one side of my paper all the way over to the other side. And then I made a horizontal or a sleeping line, and now I'm making a pattern of those two lines. This is called an A-B pattern. The A is the first line that I made. That's the zigzag. The B is the horizontal or the sleeping line that I made. And because I repeated that, I have created an A-B pattern. You need to think about what kind of line pattern you want to create on your 3 pieces of paper. That's right. We're going to do this 3 times, but I don't want the same pattern on all 3 papers. I want something called variety to make my artwork interesting. So now that this one is finished, I'm going to carefully move it out of the way and get a couple of other pieces of paper. Now these 2 pieces of paper are smaller, and I also wanted them to be different color because variety. I wanted them to be different. So this line that I'm repeating is a dot line. So I'm just making little circles or little dots with my paint marker. You may be using a paint marker. You may be using a different art supply. Regardless of what you're using, we're still making a pattern, something that repeats. When you make a dotted pattern that repeats, we call it polka dots. So think about what kind of line you can repeat or dot that you can repeat to create your pattern. Now that I'm almost finished with this one, I'm thinking ahead for my next line. I made a horizontal or a sleeping line on my first paper. Maybe on this other paper, I can make an awake or a vertical line, one that is going up and down. But because I want to have many of those lines on my paper, I'm drawing them all in a row. Can you think of other lines that you might want to draw on your paper? So I thought I would share with you a couple of more ideas. Maybe you could make a loop-de-loop line. Imagine a line that's like being on a roller coaster where you go upside down. I don't want to go on that roller coaster, but it might make for a really fun line. How about one that looks like teeth? Maybe a little bit of like SpongeBob teeth. So be thinking about the kind of line you want to make. Now, you might not be using a paint marker. You might be using paint sticks like these. Notice they make a different kind of texture, but you can still create a pattern of lines, like a pattern of zigzags, or maybe even a pattern of wavy lines. Notice I start at one end of my paper and end at the other end, just like I did with the other supply. You might even be using something like paint. So if you're painting your lines, you can use your brush to draw your lines. Here I'm creating something called dashed lines. And again, I'm making a pattern. It's a pattern because it repeats. No matter what supply you use, make sure that you're using lines to create a repeating pattern on 3 sheets of paper. We're going to be using those 3 sheets of line patterned paper for our collage. But before we dive into our collage, we better get started on creating those 3 sheets of paper with our line designs. Let's go. Today we're going to do a little bit of flower printing. So to do that, I'm going to draw a circle that's orange in the middle of my pizza pan with my paint marker. And now using my yellow paint marker, I'm going to make some loops or some oval shapes that are radiating or coming from the orange circle. Can you guess what I'm making? Did I already say? I'm making a flower. Most importantly, I'm making a sunflower, which is perfect for this time of year when it's fall and they are in bloom. I'm going to outline it a little bit with some orange, but really I'm just kind of playing with the shape. Flowers are what's called an organic shape. Organic means a shape found in nature. I'm going pretty quickly because I'm about to make a print. So I need for the paint to stay nice and wet so that I can grab all of that paint with my paper. Let me show you. Now that I have my sunflower finished, I'm going to take my piece of paper and set it down. And once I put my paper down, I cannot move the paper. That will smear my print. I have to hold it really still with one hand and massage with the other. And check it out. I just did something called pulling a print. I'm going to do a couple of these sunflower prints, so let's go through that one more time. But first, we need to kind of wipe off this other print. So I'm going to get a little bit of water on my pizza pan before wiping it off. Do you remember the first step? The first step was to draw a circle and fill it in. Remember, we need to move pretty quickly because we want to do this before the paint dries. And now I'm making oval lines or shapes that are radiating or coming from that circle in the middle. I can use a little bit of orange to outline the edge of some of the flower petals. For the black, I'm going to put a little dot in the middle, draw a circle, and then maybe outline a couple of the flower petals. Now, I didn't speed this video up. I'm really going this quickly because I have to make my print before the paint dries. Grabbing my piece of paper, I'm going to set it down on top of my pizza pan. Where's that paper? Here it is. Set it down, hold it still with one hand, don't let it wiggle, and press and massage. Paper likey. Now I'm going to pull the paper up. Pull the paper. I'm going to pull the, there we go. And would you look at that? I've got another flower print. Try making a couple, maybe even 3 flower prints. Now, if you don't have paint markers, you can use paint. The steps are the same. So instead of drawing that orange circle, I'm painting it. And again, I'm painting it pretty quickly because I don't want the paint to dry. In fact, when I paint it, I do 2 things. I paint thickly with a thick amount of paint and quickly. And now I'm painting those ovals going away or radiating away from that orange circle. Sometimes it might help to even rotate or turn the pizza pan so that you can better reach the parts of the flower petal that you want to create. Now that I've got that made, I'm going to fill in my flower petals. Again, I'm painting thickly. I want to have a nice, thick, juicy paint because I have to make sure that it's nice and wet to make my print. Now using some of my orange, I'm just outlining some of the leaves. You might have noticed I cleaned my paintbrush before getting another color. And I'm going to do that right quick now, making sure to wash and draw an X on dirty old SpongeBob right there before putting a little dot in the middle and then outlining the circle and then maybe outlining some of the flower petals. Now, no two sunflowers are alike. No two sunflowers are perfect. So don't you worry your cute little artist head about making yours look a certain way or making it look just right. When I tell you that it's going to be amazing, I ain't lying. I'm telling you the truth. Just make sure that you press firmly and don't let that paper wiggle. And let's see if I painted nice and thickly and quickly to pull a print. Again, you're going to make 2 or 3, or maybe even more of these. Now let's go. Let's take some of those papers that we created the other day and make a collage. So I'm going to use one of these papers to create a table for a still life. So I began by bringing the bottom of the paper to the top and folding it in half before opening it back up. And you might notice I have a crease or a folded line on my paper. Starting at the bottom of my paper, I'm going to bring it up to that creased line. There it is. And then fold. Now, when I flip my paper over, I'm going to have 2 creased lines. I'm going to cut the one that is closest to the edge, and this long, skinny rectangle of paper, this is going to be my table. This paper that's green is going to be the background. It's going to serve as the back of the paper. So now that I have this, I need to glue it to there. It's going to go right at the bottom of my paper. So to do that, you could use glue. For me, today, I'm going to use a glue stick. When I use a glue stick, I always make sure to wind the glue stick so that it comes up just a little bit like a chapstick. And then I'm going to draw around the edges. Sometimes people only put a little bit of glue in the middle. Well, that's not going to do you any good. You got to make sure that the glue goes around the edges. And you need to do it kind of quickly, just like when we were painting those flowers, because we need to do it before it dries. Now, whenever I glue something, I always flip my paper over and give my paper a massage on the back. That gives the glue something called grab time. Now, we made 3 painted papers. I'm folding this one in half, just like I did the other one. And that's going to give us a crease. I'm going to unfold that paper and cut along that crease. What we're going to use this paper for is to create a vase to hold our flowers. You remember those flowers that we created by printing? We're going to put them in a vase. To create my vase, I'm going to fold my paper in half lengthwise, meaning it was long. It was going side to side. Fold it in half, and then this is important. You want to make sure your fold is on the left where my hand is holding the paper in place. I could draw a letter C for the top of the vase and then a curve going in the opposite direction for the bottom, like a big, long, stretched out S. If you wanted to add a couple of fancy handles to your vase, you could. There's any number of ways that you could create your vase, but it's important that you make sure that you have your fold on the left and you draw on the right. The reason is because that folded line is going to hold both halves of your vase together. Notice I'm cutting slowly and carefully, and let's check out and see what this vase looks like. Ooh, that's pretty fancy. Now I could leave it just like that, or I could cut out these handles. Notice I did that separately, not connected to the vase. So it's going to look like two little ears, I guess, on my vase. You don't have to do that unless you want to. In fact, you could just put one of the handles on and then it would look like a pitcher or something that was holding water for your vases. Once you've figured out how you want your vases to look, glue goes around the edges, not just the dot in the middle, because what good is that going to do you? And then you can glue your vase down. So we've used our 3 pattern papers, one for the background, another for the table, and the third for the vase. Don't forget to flip the paper over and massage. If you have those little handles, they get glue also. Don't forget to add them and then give your paper a massage. Now, once your vase is in place, it's time to move on to the next step. If you use paint markers like me, what I'm going to do first is outline my vase. When you outline something, that means you are drawing around the edges, the outside. That's why it's called an outline. So I'm outlining my vase so that it really stands out. I'm giving my vase something called emphasis. Now, if you also have a green paint marker, you can use this to create some lines and some leaves and some foliage and some plants, because that is what we're going to be gluing our flowers on top of. So decide what kind of lines and leaves you want to create, and then we're going to set this aside to dry before we add our flowers. If you painted a big piece of paper for the background, then when you make your table, you're just going to fold your paper in half one time before cutting it, putting glue around the edges and gluing it in place. So here I am going around the edges with my glue, similar steps, but just different size paper. And then I'm going to glue it in place. Now, once that's in place, what was the next step? I have a background. I have a table that's in the middle ground. And now it's my vase. So this time I'm going to fold my paper in half side to side, and I need to draw the top of my vase, the bottom of my vase, and then I can decide on the shape of my vase. But if you remember, the fold is on the left side. That's important because that's what keeps our vase connected. If I draw on the open side, then I will have 2 halves or a broken vase. So it's important that your fold is on the left. Once you've got your vase finished, don't forget glue around the edges, and then we can outline and add our plants. If you don't have paint markers, well, then you can simply paint your plants. And I'm using green paint. I've got my paintbrush, and I like to start with the line. So I draw or paint a nice long line. Usually it's not straight because organic things that grow in nature, like plants and leaves, they don't usually grow in a very straight line. Instead, they move a little bit and they reach and stretch toward the light of the sun. So when you're painting your plants, you might want to think about that. Think about the line that you can create that's more organic or something that you might see in nature. Don't forget you have this big, beautiful area above your vase to fill. Let those plants reach and stretch for the sunlight. And then once you have your line made, think about the different kinds of organic shapes you could create for your leaves. For some of these, I made short little lines. For others, I made rounded lines. And for some, I made even long lines. Now, when this is finished, you could also outline your vase by picking a color that you think will help make your vase have emphasis or really stand out. I decided to go with a nice bright blue, and I even decided to give the table a little bit of emphasis. I used the same blue to outline that too. Now we're going to move back to our flowers. Do you remember those beautiful flowers we printed? Well, this part gets a little bit tricky because we need to slowly and oh so carefully cut the shape of the flower out. So you'll notice that my scissors, they always point outward. And look how much my left hand is rotating the paper for me. If you make sure that your left hand or your right hand, whatever hand is holding the paper, is doing a lot of the work of rotating and moving the paper, then I promise you won't get tired from cutting. Sometimes my students tell me my hand is tired from cutting, and that's usually because you're turning the wrong hand. You need to make sure that the hand that is holding the paper does all of the work of rotating, and that will help you get around all of those beautiful flower petals. You spent so much time making such beautiful flowers that I know you'll want to cut them out so carefully. Once your flowers are cut out, then it comes time to finish our amazing still life sunflower collage by gluing them down. Glue goes around the edges, and there's a lot of edges when it comes to these flowers. Decide where you want them to go before you stick them in place. It's pretty hard to move them around once you've got them stuck, so make sure you have a good idea of your composition, the placement of things, before you glue them down and give it a massage. Would you look at that? Now you might have a smaller, beautiful collage like this one, and if that's the case, your flowers might be kind of big and they might stick off of your paper a little bit. That's okay. Just make sure they don't cover up too much of your vase so that we can see all the hard work you put into your vase and in your plants. It's okay if they stick off of your paper just a little bit. It makes it look like they're really coming out of the picture and coming out to the person who's looking at your work of art and who isn't going to stop in their tracks and take a look at your amazing work of art. I cannot wait to see what fabulousness you create. Toodles!